All right, as noted, we're moving on with the social psychology here of mental state attributions. This is directly following up on what we talked about with um, theory of mind, that we observe other people, social perception, and then we make inferences to try to understand what's going on, quote unquote, behind the scenes, right? What are they thinking? Why are they doing what they're doing? What are their intentions? What are their motivations? What are they feeling? What are their emotions? And part of this in social psychology is called attribution theory, right? So the idea is that when we observe others, we make attributions about why they do what they do. And that means making either what is called an internal attribution or an external attribution. Synonyms for this, sometimes you might see internal attributions also described as dispositional or personal attributions. And what this all means is that I am explaining their behavior by appealing to something internal to them, some part of their personality or their disposition. I'm basically saying they're doing what they're doing because that's the person that they are. That's who they are. It's a behavior that comes from something inside of them, which means I'm internalizing and mentalizing this explanation, right? External attributions are sometimes referred to as situational attributions because I'm explaining their behavior by talking about the context, right? The environment, what's happening around this person at the time, right? What situation are they in? One example of this could be dealing with something like if I observe somebody who does maybe misbehaves in some way, they cheat in a class, they lie to another person, and I might ask, now that I have learned this, I've observed this behavior in one way or another, I could think to myself, why did they do that? Right. And so I might think, okay, they're just dishonest, in which case I'm making an internal or personal or dispositional attribution. I'm saying that that dishonesty is who they are. Right. On the other hand, I could say that, well, no, it was the situation they were in, right? It was a tough spot, right? They found themselves in a tough spot and they must have felt that they had to do that because of XYZ, right? I'm rationalizing, explaining maybe, but what I'm really doing is I'm saying it's the person themselves are not inherently dishonest. It's the behavior is a function of their environment, of their situation. So we do this, and this is just a natural tendency, of course. And what social psychologists like to study are a lot of the factors involved in why do we sometimes make internal attributions about other people, and why do we sometimes make external attributions about other people. One of the things that social psychologists have learned about this, and I think now this is relevant for this class, cognitive psych, is that we have certain biases that come up. And so we've talked about reasoning and judgment biases before. A lot of these are based off of things that are related to a kind of misuse of statistical information and probabilities and base rates and stuff like that. And that can still sometimes be a little relevant to these social biases as well. One more thing I want to say about these biases in general before I get into the details is that second point on this slide about predicting others' behaviors. This is important because one of the reasons that we want to make attributions about other people is over time, as I do this, if I what might happen is that I start to get a sense of whether or not a person's behavior is consistent. So it's one thing that I meet somebody for the first time, I learn something about them from watching what they do, and I make some attributions about them. But then as I quote unquote get to know them, what's happening is that I am observing their behavior again and again and again, and I continue to update my attributions about this person so that over time, what's happening is that I'm starting to be able to better predict them, right? And if I get to know this person well enough, because I've perhaps made enough internal attributions about them, that I think I know who they are as a person, and I think I've gotten to know their personality. So then once I know them well enough that I might call them a good friend, I could probably say things like, "Oh, I know exactly what they would do in this situation, or what they would say in this situation," because now I've got to know them. But that's because I have done enough of this kind of attribution and interaction and observation with them and getting feedback on my attributions that I'm better able to make these predictions. So over time, we might think that there could be some degree of calibration happening with our social judgments of others. But nevertheless, let's talk about the biases here. So the first one is called the fundamental attribution error. What this refers to is the idea that we have a tendency to default to making internal attributions about others. So even if we had some reason or maybe some information that might justify an external attribution, we sometimes just ignore that and we focus on the person. The salience might be an explanation for this, by the way. If you think about the availability bias, we talked about the idea that sometimes we overestimate the likelihood of something happening because how easy it is for us to think about it. It's a little more salient to our memory. And when I'm watching another person, the most salient thing is actually the person themselves, right? It's not necessarily the situation. I see the world from my own first person perspective, but when I watch another person, I'm watching them from a third person perspective. So that person becomes really the key thing of interest in my observation here. So it might be that because of their salience as an actor in a situation that I'm watching, I have an increasing likelihood of making a personal attribution. The flip side of that is that we can also make self-attributions. And so the inverse of the fundamental attribution error about us making internal attributions about other people is that if I'm asked to make a self-attribution, if someone asks me, why did you do this? I'm more likely to make a situational attribution about myself, again, because the external environment, I see the world from my own first-person view. The external environment is far more salient than me. I don't really see my own body when I engage in some action necessarily, right? I can see my hands maybe, but that's about it. Research on this, for example, shows that if you have people making moral decisions in front of a mirror, they're more likely to try to adhere to their moral beliefs because they see their reflection and that makes themselves more salient, and that increases their likelihood of making an internal attribution about themselves. If they were about to do something immoral, they're less likely to do it in the presence of a mirror. It's an interesting kind of an applied thing there, right? If you want to prevent shoplifting in a store, you can place mirrors in various locations so that if people see their reflection, they might stop to think about themselves, and that might prevent them from doing this, right? That's an open question a little bit there. Another bias that we have already talked about in that chapter on biases is the representativeness bias, and that's based on the idea of making broad attributions, not just about an individual, but as a whole large group of people, right? And again, we've talked about how the cognitive economy view here would explain how it's difficult for us to track a lot of information about a lot of different group of people, so it can be a little easier on our limited resources to work in this way. But certainly, of course, that does represent another form of a social bias. One more way to think about the way these systems work is to think about type 1 and type 2 systems when we talked about Kahneman's research here, right? So that type 1 systems were the ones that are fast and automatic and happen intuitively without a lot of thinking, and the type 2 processes are the ones that require a little more deliberation and a little thought. And this can be used when talking about implicit bias. So the idea of an implicit bias, going back to the stereotype idea here, is it's important to emphasize that whether or not we believe a given stereotype about a group of people, and most people know the content of these stereotypes, right? So you can have various stereotypes about any sort of group that's out there. But just because you have knowledge of the stereotype and you know what sorts of maybe even sometimes negative stereotypes are associated with certain groups, that doesn't mean you believe it, and it doesn't mean that you act on it or you let that knowledge influence how you interact with people who are members of that group, right? So the idea here is that it is possible to implicitly activate the knowledge of the stereotype, right? So the idea is that you can use priming procedures and backward masking procedures and stuff that we've talked about before using language that is associated with certain negative stereotypes. And so what we see here, the idea is that using this kind of system one approach, you can implicitly activate knowledge of the stereotype without the person even knowing that you have activated that stereotype. And then we find evidence that this can actually possibly sometimes have subtle influences on people's behavior. Except, this is what the research of Patricia Devine noted here at the very bottom, going all the way back to 1989. I was a freshman in college then. So what she found in this research is that whether or not people let the implicitly activated stereotype influence their behavior depended on one of two things, right? So what would happen here is that after they activate this stereotype using the implicit priming kind of procedure, these people are then asked to make various social judgments about others. And what she found is that some of the participants, the Ps, that's my abbreviation for that, would actively inhibit the stereotype using this kind of type 2, inhibitory cognitive control process to actively prevent that from influencing their social judgments, whereas other people did not do that. So we have two different kind of outcomes here, right? One group of people who seem to be actively inhibiting that implicitly activated stereotypical knowledge, and others who were not. But she then later gave these people surveys designed to measure their tendencies to be prejudicial. And what she found is that the same people who failed to inhibit those stereotype activations were the ones who scored a little high on these prejudicial belief scales, suggesting that maybe we could use this as a way of understanding the differences. And these outcomes here is the additional use of type 2 inhibitory processing to inhibit the effect of stereotypes on our judgment can be a marker of someone who avoids prejudicial kinds of behaviors when interacting with people of various groups. So kind of influential work there coming from Devine. Another way to talk about predicting others and the relevance of that here is to talk about cooperation and competition. So this happens in a lot of different social environments where what we need to do is we need to figure out if the person that I'm interacting with is friend or foe, right? So this could happen, for example, if you just go to the car dealership and you're going to buy a car. And so the idea is that certainly you're going to think that the person, the agent that's the salesman who's selling you the car, is being selfish, right? Because they want to sell the car because they're going to get a commission, and so that's good for them. But oftentimes they will present themselves as more cooperative. They're going to try to present themselves as being a friend, and their goal is to help you find the car for you, right? So this ability to understand when someone is really being cooperative and when versus when they're maybe more competing with us and they don't have our best interests in mind is certainly a very important kind of social skill that we need to have. One way in which the cooperation and competition dilemma becomes relevant is in the famous prisoner's dilemma. So this is tested in a whole variety of different contexts, but here's a classic one right here. It's the original, I think, variation, where we have two prisoners, prisoner A, prisoner B. You're supposed to imagine that you're one of these two people and you're basically given a choice. So you could be told that if you confess to the crime, you're prisoner A, let's say. So if you confess to the crime, but prisoner B also confesses to the crime, we're going to give you both a prison sentence, but it will be moderately brief, 5 years. No one wants to spend 5 years in prison, but still it's worse. It's not as bad as the 20-year option, right? So on the other hand, what if you confess and the other person does not confess, right? So they just don't say anything. Well, that means that you get to go away scot-free. So you are rewarded for your confession by not being allowed to have, not being required to go to jail whatsoever. But the other person has to go for 20 years now. So you might think, hey, there is a benefit possibly to confessing, right? Now, if you remain silent, this is where it gets tricky, right? So you think there's a benefit to confessing because there's a chance if the other person doesn't say anything that you don't go to jail, right? You just get to go free. But if you remain silent, and the other person remains silent, this is the bottom right part of the matrix, you both only go to prison for 1 year. So you think, hey, maybe there's an advantage to remaining silent here and not admitting to anything because, okay, we both go to jail, but it's only a year. It's better than the 5 year option that's on the table if I confess, right? But of course, there is a risk of remaining silent because if I remain silent and the other person confesses, now I'm the one who goes to prison for 20 years and the other person goes home free. So, of course, when we've talked before about this kind of decision-making situation, we talked about prospect theory and when, how the framing works and when this is framed in terms of gains or losses that can influence um, our outcomes here. And so we might think that the prisoner's dilemma kind of has a loss framing, and that makes us more likely to remain silent. Minimizes our risk a little bit, but of course it depends. Now, what's important here is that, well, here's a variation. Let me just mention this real quick. So the prisoner's dilemma maybe has a loss framing because what we're worried about here is going to prison, right? We're losing our freedom. On the other hand, another variation of the prisoner's dilemma is called cash or trash, right? So what happens is that you get a choice between one of two suitcases, briefcases, and one of them has cash in it and the other one has trash in it. Obviously, you want to get the one that has cash in it. And of course, if you both choose cash, you get to split the jackpot. But if you say, I choose cash and the other person says trash, then you get it all. So there's a motivation to competing here, right? But obviously, that's framed in terms of gains because if you lose this game, you don't necessarily lose anything. You just failed to win this big cash jackpot. Whereas in the original prisoner's dilemma, it's more of a risk of losing your freedom, right? So depending on the framing of the situation, and even though the logic and the outcomes are mathematically equivalent in these two cases, when it's framed in terms of losses or gains, we're going to have this kind of an effect. So again, but where this is relevant to our topic here is that it's useful to be able to predict what the other person is going to do, right? So if I'm in a completely different room with the person that I'm interacting with, if I'm person A, the other person is person B, and we're just left in different rooms, uh, then I have to just figure out mathematically what's the best choice for me because I have no information about what this other person is likely to do. But what if I'm face to face with this person and we both say something like, let's both agree that we're going to, like, let's go with the cash or trash example here, right? So if we both choose cash, we split the jackpot, right? But if I say cash and the other person says trash, then how's it work, right? So I'm participant A. So if I choose uh, trash, right? So the idea here is that I want to try to be selfless, right? And I want to say I'm going to choose the other one. And then the other person happens to say trash as well, then we both get nothing. But if I say trash and the other person says cash, then I'm rewarded for that by getting the whole jackpot. There's a variation of this that's maybe a little bit clearer. So let me phrase it this way. There was an actual game show. You can look it up online. I think it was a British game show where they have the two people sitting face to face. And again, the idea is that they can both say we're going to share, right? So if we say that we're going to share, then what that means is when both people say share, they really do share and they split the jackpot and they both go home with half of the big money prize. But on the other hand, if one person says steal, and while the other person says steal, then what happens is that they both go home with nothing because now you're being punished because you're both being selfish. But if I say steal and the other person says share, what happens is that I get to keep it all and the other person goes home with nothing. So there is a bit of a benefit for me saying steal. But what I have to do is I have to get the other person to believe that I'm not going to say steal, right? So that's where the game show becomes relevant because I'm going to try to convince this person I'm going to say share. Are you going to say share too? Let's both say share so we can split the prize and we both go home happy. I promise you I'm going to say share. I promise you I'm going to say share. right? And in many cases, that's exactly what happens. Both people try to convince the other person that we're going to share, and they share, they go home happy, right? Not a very dramatic outcome for the game show. But what is more dramatic is that if someone spends half of the episode really trying to convince the other person how much they're really going to say share, and then it comes to the final decision and they write their answers down on a little slip of paper and give that to the host, and the host opens up the pieces of paper and it turns out our person, one person was convinced, and they said and they thought, okay, I believe the other person's going to say share, so they choose that answer. But then the other person had actually wrote down steal, and then they have that person walks away with everything, right? And our person who was gullible and believed them gets nothing. So that creates a little more drama for the outcome of the television show. But this relates to this cooperation and competition kind of dichotomy here, right? When can we really determine if someone is truly telling us the truth, that they are willing to cooperate and share, versus when they are not? And of course, that's a tricky thing to do. We could appeal to the whole idea of inference, right? That I have to look at their behavior, their body language, listen to their voice, not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it, their eye contact, all kinds of little things like that. And how reliable is all of that stuff? Because somebody might just be really good at lying, right? So, but this kind of highlights the importance here of how these kind of cognitive factors, right? There's the social cues, the perceptual cues, but then there's all this stuff about the framing effects in terms of gains and losses, and all of this has to influence my social judgment about the other person, right? This idea of making attributions about others, we can also kind of look at this in a famous demonstration here. So this comes from way back in the 1940s, referred to as the Hyder and Simmel simulation. And what we have here is a little video that shows this little triangle in a box, but then along comes another triangle and a circle, and they're all going to have a little bit of a interaction here. So when we watch this video, even though we're just seeing geometric shapes moving about on screen, it becomes very quickly. Most people who watch this video all agree that we are watching three people engaged in a certain kind of conflict here, and it gets a little dark and scary, I think, in one part here, right? So the question is what are we doing here, right? When we look at this and we start to see these shapes as people engaged in some sort of intentional, motivated action, experiencing emotions, and so forth, then we are attributing mental state to others, right? And it's this theory of mind, right? But on what basis, right? So that's our question: is what is happening in this that causes us to attribute any kind of mental state to these geometric forms? And well, our last triangle got mad and broke apart the little room there. Clearly, it can't be based on the shapes, right? People don't look like triangles and circles. So it may be, of course, based on their movement. And so understanding the role of these movement-based cues might, in fact, be kind of important here. Whoops, hitting the wrong buttons everywhere because I'm trying to get to my little arrow. There we go. All right. And this raises some very curious possibilities that relate to social perception that are some newer hypotheses that we might want to explore a little bit. So everything that I've said so far about social perception and cognition is that we can't read the minds of others. So what we do is we observe their actions and then we make inferences, right? We might also call that indirect social perception because of the idea that I can't really directly perceive that person's mind, so I can only observe their actions, and then using that as information, I infer what's going on in their minds, right? Can we have a theory of direct social perception? Is that something that could be possible? Now, this doesn't mean that we're psychics, right? That doesn't mean that we literally read other people's minds, but rather there is another justification for this. And what's happening here is that this appeals to a few things. Back in the perception chapter, we did mention Gibson's ecological theory of perception, which is a direct perception theory. The argument there is that in contrast to indirect or sensation mediated theories of perception that talk about bringing in meaningless sensations and then using them to infer what's going on out in the world, that instead perception is based on meaningful patterns of information out there in the world, optic array and all that sort of stuff. Therefore, perception doesn't require inference. So that's Gibson's basic theory for perceiving the world around us. But now this idea is that we're going to try to extend that to the social world as well. And that when I'm observing other people, I'm not just perceiving things that I have to infer the meaning of, but I'm directly perceiving what we might call motivated action or intentional actions, right? Part of this is Gibson's notion of an affordance, right? So Gibson's claim is that an important part of direct perception is perceiving the things that we can do in the world, right? What kinds of actions can I take, right? So even something like a pen here, I can perceive that one thing I can do with it is hold it in my hand because it matches the scale and shape of my hand and it fits within my hand. So perceiving that kind of environmental fit is an important part of perception and action here. So Gibson also could extend this by saying that when it comes to interactions with other people, there could be kinds of certain social affordances. So the cooperative person is the person that affords a certain kind of cooperative interaction with. A competitive person, or again, friend or foe, the foe would afford a different kind of interaction. So the idea is that if I'm perceiving what we might call a social affordance, what kinds of behaviors can I engage in when I'm interacting with this other person? Can I trust this person, cooperative, competitive, friend, or foe? Right? That's going to influence my social interaction. So a Gibsonian approach would say that we could directly perceive these so-called social affordances, right? And therefore know cooperative and competitive. Of course, how to explain deception, that's a tricky thing here. But one thing in modern cognitive science that this is also consistent with is the thesis known as embodied cognition and also inactive cognition. These are part of the many E's of 4E or 5E cognitive science. And embodied cognition is the idea that, we have this tendency to sometimes think of cognition as just being this abstract thing that happens inside of us somewhere in our brains. But embodied cognition tries to reject that abstract view of mind and says that no, you can't really have mind without brains and you can't have brains without bodies. And so therefore, cognition really happens in the body. It is constituted of the body, constituted being the key word there, right? That mind is made, cognition is made of the body. It is constituted of it. So that means that seeing other people's bodies and how they move and doing things, that's the inactive side, that cognition is enacted by the things that we do. So that means that when I'm observing other people's actions, I'm not just seeing actions, I'm seeing embodied and enacted cognitions. And therefore, if I can see those things, then I should be able to see their cognition. And so that's the claim here, is that there's something about the pattern of movement. So thinking back to the Hyder and Simmel simulation there's something about the way those pieces moved and the way they interacted with each other allowed me to see the social affordance of friend and foe in that video. It also allowed me to then, because those movements were actually done by hand, that there was a real life person moving those things around, that there was some embodiment there. And it was embodied and enacted. And this maybe allows a form of direct social perception here. By the way, this view is also consistent with an older view coming from a Gestalt psychologist named Kurt Lewin, who is sometimes seen as one of the founders of modern social psychology, as it turns out. And so what Lewin talks about here is the idea of a person-environment unit of analysis, right? That we have a tendency in psychology to treat the mind inside of the person as distinct from the outside world, and that studying the outside world is the job for the other sciences like physics or something, whereas studying what's happening inside the person is the job of psychology, right? But if we dissolve that boundary and we treat people and environments as inseparable units here, then that means the person environment unit, or as I had kind of described it before with the brains and bodies, the brain body environment unit becomes the fundamental unit of analysis. And it would be wrong for us to try to understand what's happening as in the mind as somehow distinct and different from what's happening in bodies and in the environment and in the world. So how do we understand that? This is where Lewin's so-called psychological field comes in. But before we get into more detail, let's point out one possible example of where this competitive versus cooperative business might become a tractable research study. So I have a little video here. Now, before I start the video, you might be able to see on your screen, I know it's probably a little small on your screen here, a bunch of little dots. And I'm not sure if you can really even make out what it is we're seeing with all of these dots. But you might think to yourself that this could vaguely look like two people who are seated at a table opposite each other, facing each other. You can't see the table, you can't see the chairs, but you could maybe see two bodies here. But maybe not, right? It just looks perhaps like a random configuration of dots. But as soon as I press play here, we can see the people start to move a little bit. So we can see that, okay, maybe I can see the person. And now they engage in an action. They have reached up onto the table and have done something. And now they're doing something again, right? So we might ask, when these people are doing this task, picking up something on the table and moving it towards the center and then moving it back away, are they interacting in a specific way? Are they being cooperative, competitive, or not neither one, right? Person on the right adjusts their seat, and now they do it. Was that competitive or cooperative? Again, was that competitive or cooperative? Now, you might have some guesses. The first two were intended to be cooperative. The other two were intended to be competitive, of course. And that's based on the instructions that were given to the actors when this video was made. These are called point light displays, where we use a motion capture system. We did this at the UCF downtown campus, really fancy motion capture studio down on the downtown campus. And so the actors were instructed to be either cooperative or competitive in these different situations. And then we make these videos with the goal of showing these videos to naive research participants to see if they can accurately judge this. And so the research does suggest that people can accurately determine competitive and cooperative movements. And it's not just what we're doing here. The research of some Italian researchers, Cristina Becchio, Valeria Manera, and a few others, have been doing this kind of research for over 15 years, I think, at this point, where they've been finding a lot of good evidence that in similar kinds of point light displays, people are able to reliably discriminate the cooperative and competitive intention here. So that this is consistent with some of this idea that, just like with the Hyder and Simmel simulation, we don't see the bodies, we don't see facial expressions, we don't see the people at all. We just see the motions carrying the information. And so this could be consistent with the idea of an embodied and active social affordance kind of view, that we could directly perceive these kinds of states without needing to infer necessarily and engage in a lot of heavy theory of mind mentalizing here, right? That the information about the mindfulness and the intentionality is directly conveyed through the pattern of motion without the need for inference, right? It's a challenging kind of a lot of traditional assumptions about social cognition here. Now, I want to unpack what I said about Lewin a little bit and his psychological field theory. But in order to talk about Lewin's field theory, we need to talk about Einstein. We're talking about Einstein and psychology, right? Okay, but we are. So when Einstein talks about gravity, he talks about redefining what gravity is, right? We used to think of gravity as just like a force, right? Just pulling things down. But Einstein redefines gravity by talking about a space-time field, right? And the idea is that what we think of as gravity is really just curvature in the space-time field. And what happens is that if you have a large massful object, like say a planet in the solar system, its mass it's not just some invisible field that pulls things into it, but what that mass does is it curves and bends space-time around it that creates something like this depression, this well, right? And so the idea is that any object that might be floating around through space is just moving through the gravitational space-time until it gets close enough to this well, right? We'll call this well a basin of attraction. And once it crosses over the so-called event horizon, it's going to roll down into that basin of attraction and get pulled down to the bottom where the center of mass of our object is. Could be like a planet, right? Or the sun or whatever, or black hole or something like that. So that means that that's how we're viewing the universe, right? Gravitational space-time is as generating this the shape and structure of a field. And there are places where there are gravitational fields that attract and pull things in. And there could also be, in a similar kind of system, repellers as well, right? These would be represented as the opposite of a basin. They would be a hill. And so it's hard for something to roll uphill, right? But it rolls downhill really easy. So a hill in our field would be a repeller, and a basin would be an attractor. This is called a topological analysis because now what we want to do is we want to imagine the topology or the shape of the entire field and where are the basins of attraction, where are the hills of repulsion. And now what we want to do is we want to adopt that framework and pull it into psychology and think about now a person moving around in such a similar kind of topological landscape. And again, that's our environment. So we're going to have our person-environment interaction being the level of analysis that we're dealing with. And this environment is going to have attractors and repellers. And of course, that can be all kinds of things. There's lots of things in our environment we might move towards, and so those would be attractors. We call these approach and avoidance behaviors in some physiological psych approaches or biopsych approaches. But in a social environment, that means friend and foe, right? So again, there's something happening in a friend who is cooperative that serves as a basin of attraction and pulls us in. And this is again just part of a lawful interaction between ourselves and the cycle and the world, right? So this is what Lewin calls the psychological field, this kind of pseudo equation that describes behavior as this kind of a function of properties of the person and properties of the field, right? And so the idea is that the person has certain internal things, right? Motivations and needs and so forth. The field or the environment also has attractors and repellers, and that you put the person in the field and behavior will naturally emerge as a way in which these two things can interact with each other. And so the idea is that now we're going to have these kinds of interactions. Of course, you can also put a second person into the field, and so the way in which they interact will create what's called a shared psychological field. And so again, we see that this emerges as a lawful kind of field theory-based explanation of behavior that kind of minimizes how much we need to appeal to internal cognitive processes and instead describes it as more of a naturally occurring dynamical system that naturally emerges as a result of the structure of the field that happens when two people interact with each other. Now, that's all necessarily pretty high level and somewhat abstract and may be difficult to follow, especially if you're not all that familiar with relativity theory and Einstein and all that business, and that's okay. I just like to talk about this stuff, and I think it's kind of a useful way to imagine how some of these areas of psychology might move forward with some new and interesting ideas of, again, direct perception, embodied and active cognitive science, field theory, and so on and so forth, right? In fact, actually, that's what's here, right? So I mentioned 4E cognitive science. We've already defined embodied and active cognition, but what are the other E's of the 4 E's? Well, there's embedded cognition, which again suggests that we're embedded into this field. So cognition has to be understood in that kind of external context of a physical environment and a social environment. And then the other 4th E is extended cognition, which is the idea that we can't separate minds and brains from the environment. So the brain-body environment interaction is the fundamental unit of analysis. And so extended cognition means that cognition is going to span across all of these things, right? It's not just happening in brains, right? It's something that happens across the brain-body environment interaction. Those are the traditional 4 E's. I like to add a 5th E, which is Gibson's ecological approach. because it is the whole idea of direct perception and environmental structure and affordances, it is all highly consistent with the other four E's. And so why not call it 5E? But it hasn't caught on yet. Um, but I'm not the only one saying this, so you don't just have to take my word for it. Anyway, I believe that that wraps us up. So, no, oh, there's one more thing. I'm sorry. Joint action. One possible advantage of taking this 4E, 5E approach is it's very useful for explaining highly complex interactions between conspecifics, that is, other members of a group or species. So, in the middle here, the phenomenon known as murmuration, right? This is when these large flocks of birds moving together in these very amazing, intricate patterns, flight patterns, where whole groups of the flock kind of start moving together, and you see these undulating kinds of pulsating patterns in these flocks. Or, of course, in something like in humans here, musical performance, right? Four musicians playing a complex musical piece together. And even though, of course, they're all following the music as it's written on their sheet music, there still needs to be an important timing to how they do it together, which means they also have to not just read their sheet music, but they have to listen to each other. And maybe they also sometimes watch each other. And the timing of that is just as complex then as the birds showing the murmuration. So this would suggest then that what happens is that once we start engaging in a shared task, this is what we'll call joint action, is a task that we're participating in with others, that it creates that kind of what we'll call shared intentionality, right? We all have the same goals, the same intentions. We're performing actions that are maybe not exactly identical to each other because we might be playing musical instruments, but we are we're doing things that have the same shared goal, right? To execute this piece of music or something like that. So that means I do have to perceive the behavior of others. So, of course, the perceptual modules, maybe the mirror neurons and all these other social networks are important. Um, but it requires a high amount of movement synchronization as well. And what's interesting here is that a lot of research shows that when people are given tasks that kind of force them to move in ways that are synchronous with each other, it causes them to later judge the other person as being more trustworthy and cooperative. So synchrony might be very important when it comes to judging cooperation. So think back to the point light displays, and one of the characteristics of the cooperative version of the task could have been something to do with the synchrony that they exhibit versus maybe in the competitive instruction they're a little less synchronized. So that might be something that's worth exploring a little bit here. That also has other interesting and applied implications here, because a new emerging area of work is the development of consumer social robots. Right? We have a lot of other kind of social technology that we can have in our homes, like Google Home and Amazon's Alexa Echo device and all this kind of stuff. But we can also have social robots that are equipped with similar kinds of intelligent, internet-connected, language-based systems. But they're also mobile and they can move around. And then, of course, what happens is that we might want to worry about how do people perceive these things, and do they perceive them as something that's safe and reliable and trustworthy to have in my home, or is it a threat to me? And so how people perceive the robot as a social agent, and in terms of its cooperativity versus its threat level or competition or whatever it might be, that can be manipulated potentially by how these things are programmed. So if we make them, if we give them the ability to synchronize their actions with their users, does that improve people's trust and cooperation with the robot? That again remains an open question. There's a whole, emerging field in human factors, applied psychology, on human-robot interaction, and this is exactly the kind of research that we do in this field, is to look at the way these things move and try to understand whether those movement patterns influence the social judgments that people make about the robots, and whether they see them as a threat versus a cooperator or something like that. So anyway, those are the applied implications here. And now I think we are officially done. So as always, let me know if you have questions.